It's 11 o'clock, so let's get started. I did the introduction yesterday and the day before, so we can just jump into the contents, right? So today I'm going to talk about social choice. I'm going to start by talking about the ethical foundations of economics and applied public policy. And then I'm going to talk about sustainability. Things have been a bit rearranged since last year, so I am not quite sure what the timing of all this is, but I'm going to try and keep it to the allotted 2 hours. Something happened. That was weird. I'm going to start, as I said, with the ethical foundations of applied economics. And that is something that you probably haven't seen before. I think that is regrettable. The reason for this is as follows, in that it's just very important, and economists tend to have, according to the rest of the world, a very peculiar idea about what is ethical and what is not so ethical. So environmental economics is all about the allocation, distribution and use of environmental resources. And in that sense, it's part of public economics. It essentially tells you how the government should intervene in certain aspects of the economy. And some of these questions are positive. What happens if we put a tax on sulfur emissions? But some of these questions are normative. How high should the tax on sulfur emissions be? And to answer these normative questions, mainstream economics has a fairly well-developed toolbox that is rooted in what philosophers call utilitarianism. And the problem with utilitarianism, well, the good thing about utilitarianism is that it's a very powerful set of tools. The problem with utilitarianism is that most everybody outside of economics hates utilitarianism. And when you're applying these things to real problems, you're immediately confronted with this because people will simply not accept your advice based on a utilitarian ethic. And that gets even more pronounced when you're applying it to environmental issues, because that tests the boundaries of our standard ethical framework even further. And that is what I'm going to talk about in this first hour. So I'm going to start with talking about naturalist moral philosophy, and then I'm going to talk to the switch to the humanist schools. You can't talk ethics without mentioning the name Immanuel Kant, who's an 18th century German philosopher, and this is what he looked like. And Kant is considered by most people one of the most important philosophers of all time. Students of philosophy still study his texts. In a way, he's comparable to Adam Smith in economics, that he's sort of like the founding father of what we're doing at the moment, but we do not make you read Adam Smith. We just still use some of his ideas, and we drop the name Adam Smith, but you guys actually do not study his book. Students of philosophy still have to read Immanuel Kant, and they're always wondering, so what did he actually mean when he wrote this? And I think the most important conclusion of 200 years of study of Immanuel Kant's work is that he was a god-awful writer, that nobody really understands what he meant when he put all those words together. But he made two important innovations in the study of ethics. And one is the introduction of a moral agent. And a moral agent is simply the smallest unit of analysis in any sort of ethical deliberation. So that is one thing. And then he introduced this rule of universality, which essentially is if a rule, or if an obligation, or a duty, or a right applies to one moral agent, it applies to all moral agents. So if I think that you cannot take my stuff, and I do think that, then if you are a moral agent, as I am a moral agent, I cannot take your stuff. Right? So it's as simple as that. Now, this sounds very much like the Christian do not unto others, but philosophers tell me that I should not say that because it is subtly different. But essentially, every right that applies to one moral agent applies to all moral agents, and every duty that we hold one moral agent to also applies to all other moral agents. So that is, I think, fairly straightforward. The question in naturalist moral philosophy is, who is a moral agent? And that is actually a fairly fundamental question and a fairly deep question. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of history there, and that history is very much the history of England. That is where we are, and I'm not going to go back into older times. So if we go back to the 18th century, then if you look at the franchise, who had the vote in England, it was rich white men. Actually not true, it was rich white Protestant men. They were the only ones who were allowed to vote for Parliament. And then there were a whole bunch of philosophers who were rich white Protestant men who said, yeah, this is how it should be. Right? It's sort of a very self-serving type of argument that government should be by rich white Protestant men for rich white Protestant men. And everybody who is not a rich white Protestant man, they do not count. They do not have political rights, and they lack a whole bunch of other rights as well. They're not true moral agents. And then this guy came along, Jeremy Bentham, and he said governments should work for the greatest good for the greatest number. And that was an astounding statement, radically left statement at that particular time. Because essentially what Bentham, a rich white Protestant man, said, poor lives matter. We should not just care about rich white Protestant men, we should also care about poor white Protestant men. And that was a radical statement, because the argument that this particular philosopher made was no longer self-serving. He wanted to serve people who were not like him. He was far, far ahead of his time, because it took 100 years from the time that he wrote this to the franchise actually being extended to poor white Protestant, poor white men. But the key here was that it was not self-serving. Now this is how Bentham is typically remembered, and I'll get back to Bentham a little bit later, that it is the greatest good for the greatest number, and this was politically interpreted as poor people or other poor men. Actually, the Catholic emancipation happened a little bit earlier. Bentham was not a fan of Catholics, but he said they should have rights too. He actually went much further than that. He also at one point argued that women are human, He also argued for moral rights for animals at one point, and for people with a different skin color. And even at one point, but he did not dare publish that, he argued that homosexuals have human rights too. He did not dare publish that. And of course it took until the 1970s in this country before homosexual sex was legalized, right? But most people sort of picked up on the poverty part of Bentham's argument. Oh my God, the government should serve all people, not just the rich ones. And that sort of, because it was no longer a self-serving argument, that sort of created this slippery slope. That it was still rich white Protestant men who did all the arguing about who counted and who did not count. But they could not say the argument is, well, they're just like us and therefore they matter, right? So the poor were emancipated first, females followed. Then we started extending rights to people with a darker skin color. But, and it was still rich white men who made these arguments, right? And the question becomes, well, where do I draw the boundary? If it's no longer a moral agent must be like me, what sets me, us, apart from non-moral agents, right? One argument that people made was, well, humans have a theory of mind, humans are self-aware, and animals are not, and therefore humans differ from animals. But then those pesky biologists came along and discovered that higher animals, elephants, dolphins, and a whole bunch of other species also have this notion of us versus them. Primates, chimpanzees and everything also seem to have some sort of notion of guilt and those sort of things. Very human sort of emotions. And perhaps we should extend moral rights to higher animals as well. You may think that, well, that is perhaps taking it a little bit far, right? But take the case of Sandra, right? Sandra had done nothing wrong. Was never stolen anything, never defrauded anybody, never killed someone, and yet Sandra was locked up in a prison for most of her life. And somebody took her case to the judge, and the judge said, why is Sandra locked up? She hasn't done anything wrong. Why is she behind bars? And the judge ordered the freeing of Sandra. Now you will think that's bad. Why is he saying this? Sandra is a gorilla, locked up in a zoo in Argentina, and the judge said she didn't do anything wrong, right? Why is she in a cage, right? And obviously animals like gorillas suffer from being locked up in a cage and definitely suffer from being in solitary lockup. But that is a matter of rights. Actually, what Bentham said, it's the greatest good about the greatest number. That is, we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that is not so much about whether you are able to recognize yourself in a mirror, or whether you feel a certain sense of shame if you double cross somebody, as chimps do, and hopefully you too. Dogs as well seem to be having that sort of emotions. But if it's really about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, then what matters is whether this particular entity is able to experience pleasure and pain, right? If you stick an elephant in front of a mirror, the elephant recognizes the elephant in the mirror as his or herself. right? It has a sense of self, and if you have a sense of self and you know where you stop and somebody else begins, and you know the difference between you and your environment, you can sort of say, yeah, that is a moral agent, that's an entity. If you stick a parakeet in front of a mirror, the parakeet will start singing, and even if the bloody parakeet in the mirror does not respond, the parakeet does not realize that the parakeet in the mirror is not a real parakeet and will continue to woo the mirror image. They don't have a sense of self. Parakeets can experience pain and pleasure. And if that is what you're aiming at, then parakeets count just as much as we do, right? And again, you may think, well, this is taking it a bit far. Now, one rule that we have in this society is that I cannot throw you in boiling water, right? That is something that is forbidden by law, and you probably think that is a good law, right? That we cannot do that. But just the other week, Parliament actually, it's not been through Parliament, but it is in front of Parliament, that boiling lobsters alive is animal cruelty and therefore no longer allowed, right? So the right that you have as a moral agent in this country not to be boiled alive, which you think is a good idea, is now being extended to animals that are just as you would suffer a tremendous amount of pain if you throw them in boiling water, right? And that is no longer allowed, right? We're still, it's not the same moral agency, right? Because I'm not allowed to throw you in boiling water, but I'm also not allowed to eat you. We're still allowed to eat lobsters, right? We're just not allowed to kill them in a cruel way. But going back to the slippery slope, the notion that animals experience pain and pleasure much like we do is because they have a central nervous system, right? So if you take a worm and you cut it in two, then you have two viable worms, right? Because worms do not have a central nervous system. If I take you and I cut you in two, then I have two halves of a dead student, right? Not so with worms. And the difference is that worms don't have a brain, right? And you do. And therefore they experience pain and pleasure in a very different way than we do. But the argument, the central argument that Bentham make, it's not like, is it about us, right? It's not like they're like us and therefore they have the same rights and duties as we do. That is no longer an argument, right? And just because we have a central nervous system does not mean that we can look down on entities that do not have a central nervous system. There's also a picture of an octopus here. Octopuses are very peculiar. They have 9 brains. They have one central brain, and then every tentacle has its own mini brain. So they're sort of schizophrenic from birth on, very peculiar, multiple personalities there, and it's very hard to imagine what their experiences would be like. But there is no reason to say, well, we have a central brain, you don't, so therefore we can do whatever, right? That is not an argument. Octopuses are actually very, very clever, and they do have personalities. It's just that they experience the world. They can't experience the world in the same way as we do because their anatomy is so very, very different. Now, occasionally you read in the newspapers or see on telly or however you get your news these days. Don't use TikTok anymore. It's now under control of the Trump administration. However you get your news, occasionally something pops up and says we have discovered life on Mars, and then people say, well, perhaps we haven't. And the reason that people say these things is because under the microscope it is actually very difficult to tell the difference between something that is alive or used to be alive and something that is only organic. And it's actually very hard to tell the difference what is alive or used to be alive and what is simply a chemical compound. And that explains why sometimes people get excited about claiming that they have discovered a sign of life on Mars without actually having seen life on Mars. It's just very, very difficult. And there's also a raging debate in biology whether viruses are alive, yes or no. They're definitely real, definitely organic, but are they alive as the same as we are? So going back to the slippery slope, where do you draw the boundary, right? And some people, some philosophers, and I'll get back to some of them, essentially say that some rights extend to non-biotic things as well. Now, some of these things are a bit peculiar to you, right? So we're in England. I assume that most of you are English. So those rules against animal cruelty, you probably understand, right? Because England was actually the very first country to have such legislation in place. A good few of you will be vegetarian and therefore extend the right that you do not want to be eaten to other animals as well, right? And that is something that you can imagine. There may be Hindus in the room or Buddhists for whom this is actually a religious rather than a moral thing. If there's any Jains in the room, then that obligation not to harm other animals actually extends to insects and stuff, right? The picture that you see here is, I think it's Uhuru. I did not double check this as preparation in Australia. And this is a sacred mountain to the Aboriginals, who would definitely object to us destroying this mountain because they think that it also represents some sort of true entity, a real entity that has rights. Not too far from there, at least from our perspective, in New Zealand, a judge actually extended the right not to be polluted, just as you have the right not to be polluted, to a river, and extended certain legal rights, namely that people can't just dump their shit in you, to a river, right? Which is definitely not a living being, right? So there are real examples of people extending rights, not duties. You cannot expect a river to do something for you, but definitely rights to things that are not like us, right? Now, as I said yesterday and the day before, these are not questions about correct and incorrect, right? These are questions about right and wrong, and you need to make up your mind where you draw the line, right? That's not for me to dictate. I can simply pose the question. Most ethical systems are humanist. That is, rights and duties are for members of the species of Homo sapiens only. And I'm going to talk about two such schools, the two extremes. One is libertarianism and the other is utilitarianism. So libertarianism goes back to Locke, who you see at the top there. And Locke was in dispute with James II and VII. So we're again in English history. And the stewards wanted to establish an absolute monarchy in England and Scotland. That was their aim, and one of the things that the stewards argued is that all land belongs to the king. And Locke said, no, this is not right. If I go into a piece of uncultivated land and I bring this land into fruition, I make it productive, then that land is mine, right? And this is actually goes back way before Locke, right? This is the German customary law that if you do something like this, then it's yours. Also, you see it in, say, the homesteading laws in the United States, that if you go into Oklahoma and you turn the prairie into farmland, then that land is yours. It does not belong to the state, it belongs to you. So Locke argued very strongly this, and this was a political argument, right? Now, this is no basis for a philosophical system, right? Because most of us don't go homesteading, right? We do other things to make a living. So Nozick added that property is also justified, acceptable, if it comes about through voluntary exchange. And then we sort of have a system of what is allowed and what is not allowed. These are the core elements of libertarianism. It's all about process. It's about rights, property rights. It's about how to transfer property rights. There is no notion whatsoever about whether the resulting society would be acceptable or just or equitable or pleasant or anything. That doesn't matter. The only thing that matters are rights and duties. And the gentleman you see on the left, and if you can read his hat, it says taxation is theft. Right? Because taxation is not a voluntary transfer of my salary to the government, right? I have no choice in this, and therefore it cannot be justified. So we're now at the extreme right of the Tory party in this country and the extreme right of the Republican Party in the United States, right, where there are people who argue this. Rothbard extended a little bit on this, so the homesteading is there, self-ownership, essentially, that sort of goes back to Locke as well. It's my labor that goes into cultivating the land, and my labor is mine, because my body does not belong to the king, my body belongs to me, right? That's essentially the argument. Free exchange is Nozick, I just talked about. And then Rothbard added also non-aggression. Essentially, in a libertarian system, you are allowed to do whatever you want, except hurt other people, right? Because that is an infringement on their rights. And these are the four core elements of libertarianism. This has major implications for government, right? There cannot be any redistributive policy, there cannot be any subsidies to students or any subsidies to higher education, right? That is your business. The government really is the night watch state, right? The government is there to make sure that we don't kill each other, that we don't steal each other's stuff. The government may have a role to play in environmental protection because that can be seen as an infringement of one person's actions on somebody else's property. But other than that, it is an argument for very limited government, right? And that is why it is sort of underlies the right-wing, the traditional right-wing, not the anti-Semitic, Islamophobic type of right-wing, the sort of traditional liberals and libertarians, right? So now let's look at utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is still it's all about humans, is the exact opposite of libertarianism, right? Libertarianism is all about rights and duties. Utilitarianism is all about outcomes. And it's about individual pleasure, that we want to maximize happiness, well-being, minimize pain, right? And then we somehow aggregate this to the greatest good for the greatest number. So it's all about the consequences, it's the primacy of outcome. There's no concept of procedural justice. If a government policy makes everybody happy, we don't care whether it's a democratic government or an autocratic government or anything. What matters is that everybody is rich and happy and safe, right? That is what a utilitarian would say. Now there's various forms of utilitarianism. The standard one, and that is the one that is used in applied economics, is that utility is individual. What matters is that I am happy, not the people around me. What matters is that I am happy. That it's humans who have moral agency, and welfare, social welfare, is simply the sum of the happinesses of all the people in a particular society. But there's also broader notions of utilitarianism where we start including altruism, when you can include non-humans, and when welfare is some function of utilities. And I'll get back to those functions in a few minutes. And this is essentially the founding from utilitarianism, and particularly narrow utilitarianism, is the founding principle of a lot of economics, right? We don't typically call this like this. We talk about Pareto and people, and Pareto, who you see at the top there, as you recall, say that the situation A is Pareto superior to situation B if at least one person is better off in situation B and nobody is worse off. And it's very hard to argue against Pareto superiority, right? If there is some action that makes somebody better off without making anybody else worse off, then who are we to object, right? And then the Pareto situation is Pareto optimal, which we also confusingly for all non-economists call efficient, and sometimes just optimal, which is just nonsense, if there are no further Pareto improvements possible. Right? If we have exhausted all Pareto improvements, then we are in the Pareto optimum. Now, this is all nice and well, but also hugely impractical, right? Essentially, this is a situation where there's any intervention is win-win, and whatever we do, there's no trade-offs. And if there's no trade-offs, then what are we arguing about? Just do it, right? If we can think of a policy that only has upsides but no downsides, then just do it. Typically what we do in applied economics is that we don't look at Pareto improvements, but we look at potential Pareto improvements. That is, we have an intervention and it is better for the sum total of society, but there are winners and losers. But in principle, the winners can compensate the losers so that the losers are not worse off and the winners are still better off, right? That is potential Pareto superiority. And that is actually what we typically do in a cost-benefit analysis or something like that. And because potential Pareto improvement is such a mouthful, we say it satisfies the Kaldor-Hicks criteria or criterion, which is just as long and just as incomprehensible to an outsider, right? This is Kaldor and this is Hicks. And working from this, we can work out the first and second welfare theorem, right? The first welfare theorem actually goes back to Adam Smith, sort of like it's not by the benevolence of the baker, blah, 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 that he sells you bread. If we leave in the invisible hand, if we leave the market to do things, then that is for the betterment of the whole of society. Smith just talked about this. Abel Lerner, who you see there at the top middle, first showed this graphically, that this is indeed the case, and Harold Hotelling to the right was the first to show this algebraically for a static society, right? That a perfectly competitive market is in a Pareto optimum. And then Oscar Lange, or Lange, who you see at the bottom there, was the first to show the second fundamental welfare theorem. That is, after transfers, after we redistribute the initial resources of the people in a society, and we let the market, the perfect market, to do what it wants, it will again reach a Pareto optimum. A different Pareto optimum, but a Pareto optimum nonetheless. And it's the second welfare theorem that makes that the Pareto optimum is not an optimum. It's not a social optimum. It is just the best you can do given the initial conditions. But if you can change the initial conditions, you can actually reach a different optimum. So that means that we need to somehow be able to evaluate that. And this is how people typically think of this. So at the top left, we have a utility function that is just an X is just all the things you care about, right? And then what we have is that social welfare W is some function of the individual utilities of everybody in a particular society. And that function W that you see there was posited first by Bergson, who you see here, later by Samuelson, but it was Atkinson who actually gave it the form that you see there. So-called CES aggregate, where essentially what we do is we take utility, we raise it to a power 1 minus gamma, we subtract 1, divide it by 1 minus gamma, and then we add all that up over everybody in a particular society. If we set gamma equal to 0, right, then we take utility, we raise it to the power 1, so nothing happens, and we divide it by 1, so nothing happens. And then we have the simple sum of utilities, and then we are sort of in the narrow utilitarianism type of world that is typically associated with Bentham. But if we let gamma grow bigger than 0, we make it positive and we let it grow, then we get a welfare function that violates Pigou-Dalton and puts more emphasis on the plight of the less well-off in society. That is best seen if we let gamma go to infinity, because then we just take then social welfare equals the utility of the person who is most miserable. And the aim of government policy is to look after the poorest, regardless of what that would do to people in the middle class and richer people, right? So that's a fairly extreme position, typically associated with Rawls. I'll come back to him. But that gives you the power of gamma, right? If we set gamma to an intermediate value, 1, then we have a Bernoulli-Ness utility function, a welfare function, sorry, and essentially instead of adding utilities, we multiply utilities. This follows, of course, from L'Hopital. And this violates Pigou-Dalton because if you do this sort of thing, then actually welfare increases, social welfare increases if we transfer resources from the rich to the poor. Then social welfare goes up. And if that is the case, then we cross the Pigou-Dalton line, right? There is, of course, no reason whatsoever to say that gamma should be positive, right? If we let gamma, because there's no mathematical reason, if we let gamma go negative, then actually we put more emphasis on the plight of the rich. And the aim of society is to make the rich richer, regardless of what it does to the poor, right? And if we let gamma go all the way to minus infinity, then we're sort of in a Nietzschean world where the aim of all of us should be to help make Elon Musk a little bit happier, right? That is our duty in society. So this framework created by Atkinson really allows for a very wide variety of political opinions, right? Now, this is what Samuelson thought, right? And then that pesky arrow came along. And he showed that if we have a society where there's two agents and three goods, or a society with three agents and two goods, and we cannot compare utility, that is, I cannot say how happy you are. I can sort of say that you look a bit less miserable this week than last week, but I cannot say that you are 10 happy, right? That is a meaningless statement. And I definitely cannot say that you are 10 happy and you are 11 happy. That is a ridiculous statement to make. So under these conditions, then there cannot be a social welfare function that is an aggregate of individual welfare function, individual utility functions, or a social preference ordering that aggregates individual preference orderings. If that social welfare function satisfies the following conditions: non-dictatorship, nobody is the boss; non-imposition, nobody tells you what you care about; unrestricted domain, that is, we can evaluate any situation; independence of irrelevant alternatives, if we are choosing between A and B, and then C pops up, and C is inferior to both A and to B, then C should not reverse our preferences over A and B, because it's a policy we would never choose, so it should not affect our decisions, as well as monotonicity, right? Monotonicity says that if somebody in society gets better off and everybody else is the same, then social welfare should go up, right? That is what monotonicity means. And that's just a variant of Pareto. If you say, well, these are reasonable characteristics for a social welfare function to have, then Arrow showed there cannot be a social welfare function, right? And this is, of course, a thing that undermines a lot of applied economics. So, what else is wrong with utilitarianism? Rawls, I said that Kant was probably the most important philosopher of all times, according to philosophers. Most people would say that John Rawls is the most important philosopher of the 20th century. Other people say it's Terry Pratchett, but serious people say it is John Rawls. And Rawls did a few things. One thing he talked about, and essentially what he did, tried to do, succeeded, is combining libertarianism with utilitarianism. And Rawls argued that a just society is a society that we would all agree on from behind the veil of ignorance. So the veil of ignorance works something as follows. Our job is to design a just society. How would you do that? Well, we would take away everybody, put them on the moon, and say, now we're going to design a just society. And after we have done that, we're going to put you back on planet Earth. But when you come back, you don't know whether you will be a man or a woman, gay or straight, risk averse or risk loving, or very good at chess or hopeless at chess. You would not know your skills, you would not know your attitudes, you would not know your position in society. And once we do that experiment, we design a society, but we don't know who we will be in that society, then Rawls argued that that society satisfies two fundamental principles. One is maximum liberty, a libertarian position, right? If you don't know what you're going to be when you get back on Earth, then you would not like any sort of imposition on what you can and cannot do, right? As long as it doesn't hurt others, you should be free to do whatever. He also argued that there would actually be very limited scope for differences in resources. That essentially we would all have roughly the same income and roughly the same spending power. And the only reason Rawls argued that some people could be richer than other people if that makes everybody better off. And one counterexample to egalitarianism is that in some jobs you need to be there from 9 till 5, right? Say a notary, you just have a job, an office job, and there's never an emergency, so fine, right? You want to be a notary, that's perfectly fine. But doctors, firemen and firewomen have to be available 24/7 in case of an emergency. And if there's no reward for being available 24/7, then why would you want to be a doctor, right? So Rawls would say, well, it's good that there's doctors in society, and therefore we need to make sure that we compensate them for emergency availability, right? So it is fine to pay doctors more than notaries. Nurses have to be available 24/7 as well, right? So it's not fine in a Rawlsian system to pay nurses less than doctors, right? And that is, so on the one hand we have sort of the libertarian position, do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't hurt others, but also we have a consequentialist position, namely that we should, to the extent possible, equalize resources and income. Utilitarians interpret this in, Rawls would strongly disagree with that. He died a while ago. That this means maximizing the utility of the worst off, right? There's other criticisms of utilitarianism. Obviously the naturalists disagree, obviously the libertarians disagree. The main person who thought about the limits, other limits of utilitarianism is this guy here, Amartya Sen, who argued a whole bunch of things. He long career with lots of paper. One thing that Sen argued is that utility is simply too narrow, and there is more to life than just goods and services. And one thing is freedom. And freedom is not an argument in a utility function, because I can be free, but I am not free unless you are free too, right? Freedom is a characteristic of a society. It's not something that is personal. So it does not fit in the utility function, and because it does not fit in the utility function, the welfare function that reflects, well, the sum total of utility, if it's not a utility, it cannot be in welfare, right? So this is wrong, according to Sen, and I would agree. Sen also argued that there's much more than individual utility. We care about other people. We also have a sense of responsibility sometimes, and we have a sense of agency. The problem with altruism is not that it doesn't exist. The problem with altruism, if you stick it in a utility function and then you start aggregating those utilities to social welfare, is that people with lots of friends count more. Because if you take a loner and nobody feels altruistic towards that particular person, then whatever happens to them only counts in their own welfare. Whereas you contrast that in their own utility and therefore in social welfare, if you contrast that to somebody who's very popular with lots of friends and family, if something bad happens to that person, then lots of people will feel bad. And if that is in the utility function and you aggregate it up to social welfare, then that person counts more than the loner. And that cannot be, right? Or I think that should not be. So that is the problem with altruism, that aggregation sort of goes wrong. There's also a problem with agency, and that is more a descriptive thing rather than a normative thing. So Sen argued that we all have multiple personalities, and the way we act around our friends and our family and our mates in the football team is different, and the expectations that we have are different, and the way we evaluate people's behavior is different. And just to drive that home as a stark example, right? If tomorrow you go to the pub and you see a guy who looks just like me and a girl who looks just like her, and you see this guy who looks just like me chatting her up, things will go through your mind. Probably out of his league, loser, go home to your wife, you sad fuck, is probably what you would think. If you would observe somebody who looks just like me and somebody who looks just like her chatting her up after class, different things would come to your mind, right? Because now there is a relationship of power. And what was a sad situation first now becomes morally objectionable, right? So how we evaluate somebody's behavior and the moral things that we attach to that behavior, whether it's good or bad, whether it's sad or very bad, depends on the context in which we operate. And all of us fluently switch context all the time, right? You're now talking to your peers, and if you walk out of this class, you're talking to your friends again, right? And you are a different person. To put that into a utility function, that the constraints that we impose on ourselves on what we can do and what we can't do, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, is actually very hard to capture in a utility function, and it's very hard, therefore, also to capture into a welfare function. That some behavior is acceptable in one context, but if the same person does something identical in another context, all of a sudden it becomes unacceptable. And that puts another limit on how well utilitarianism and other ethical systems, for that matter, capture what we truly care about, right? So the takeaway message here is that yes, a lot of what you learn in economics and a lot of what economists do is based on utilitarian principles and utilitarian foundations, but you should be aware that this is not the only way to do things, and that there are problems with this, and those problems can be very severe. And definitely if we're talking about environmental implications, the notion that we focus on humans and we want to maximize the sum total or something or some aggregate of the utility of humans at the exclusion of other animals and plants is of course something that a lot of people would disagree with, right? Okay, we're going to break for 10 minutes and then I'm going to talk about sustainability. I'm going to talk about sustainability for the remaining 40 minutes or so. Key of Outer Banks says that sustainability is hot. The sun is a fan, and if you watch the show, then you should know that Key is always right. I'm going to start by talking about the roots of sustainability. Then the two main groups, talk a little bit about degrowth, and then finally spend some time on a social construct. I think the first to define sustainability, and I think still the best definition that there is, goes back to John Stuart Mill in an 1857 book. This is John Stuart Mill. There's another person there. On his deathbed, John Stuart admitted that most of the work was actually co-authored with Harriet Taylor Mill, his erstwhile friend and later wife. And I think it should really be attributed to both of them. And what they wrote in 1857 is, if the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or a better population, we sincerely hope for the sake of posterity that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. And there's a whole bunch of things in there. The first thing is stationary long before necessity compels them to it. So this was 1857. This was in the classical period of economics. And most economists believed with Malthus that growth was limited and finite, and at one point society would sort of come to a halt. Malthus was the first to formulate this, and essentially Malthus' argument is that population growth is exponential. It's a multiplicative process, whereas the production of food only increases linearly. It's an additive process. And in the long run, exponents always win, exponential trends always win from linear trends, right? Population increases exponentially, food production increases linearly. At some point we will run out of food, right? And that is the Malthusian catastrophe. And classical economists basically all believe that Malthus was correct. Ricardo, better known for his work on international trade, argued, yeah, Malthus is mostly right, but we should make a distinction between the internal margin and the external margin. The internal margin is if you improve existing farmlands. The external margin is if you bring uncultivated lands into cultivation. But then Ricardo also reckoned that our ancestors were actually quite smart, and the land that we brought first into agriculture are actually the most productive. So yes, the extensive margin is there, but it's perhaps not as important as I initially thought, right? So like all classical economists, Ricardo believed that economic growth would end. And this is remarkably persistent, right? So many years later, 100 years later, William Jevons wrote essentially the same thing, but replacing food with coal. And Jevons was worried about us running out of coal. And it's in retrospect is the most silliest thing you could worry about. That's what you see in the graph. This is coal production. That sort of the limits to coal resources would put a stop to the industrial revolution that never materialized. Also going back another 100 years forward into the future, not back into the future, forward into the future, the Club of Rome in 1972 wrote essentially the same story and said we're going to run out of oil and the world economy as a result will collapse in 1980. Now, you weren't around in 1980, I was. We did not run out of oil, and you probably did notice that, and society did not collapse in 1980. So this has been a remarkably persistent myth. Mill and Mill, and now Harriet Taylor is a little bit older, further sort of qualified what Malthus and Ricardo were saying, but there's also innovation. That is, we get ever better at doing stuff. And there's, of course, input substitution. If we're running out of if we're running out of conventional oil, the stuff that you find in Saudi Arabia, we go for shale oil, the stuff that you nowadays find in the United States. And actually, the world has a surplus of oil at the moment. Sort of like casting further doubt on whether there are sort of resource limits to growth. And this particular position that we will always outsmart resource constraints is very much the majority position amongst economists, right? Now, Mill and Mill also argued in 1857 in the same publication that there's actually more to life than just material consumption, and they even went as far as saying it's only in backward countries of the world that increased production, that is increased GDP, is still an important objective. Of course, Peter Kyle, who used to be clever, but is now the minister of whatever, the secretary of whatever, has made this again the central plank of the UK government, right? That economic growth is the only thing that really matters. Mill and Mill would say that this is backward. And elaborating on this, Mill and Mill wrote, "There is room in the world, no doubt, for a great increase in population, supposing the arts of life to go on improving, that is technological progress, and capital to increase. The density of population necessary to obtain all of the advantages, both of cooperation and of social intercourse," this is older English, this just means interacting with other people, has been attained. The population may be too crowded, they'll all be amply supplied with food and raiment, that is clothes, nor is there much satisfaction in contemplating the world without nothing left to the spontaneous activity of nature. So essentially what they said, there is more to life than material consumption. And they were the first to formulate this. And now going back to sustainability, essentially what they argued, yes, they were sort of in line with Malthus and with Ricardo saying economic growth must come to an end because we live on a finite planet with finite resources. So we cannot grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. We will outgrow the planet at one point. But what they actually argue in these two sides is we don't want to go there. We actually want to stop some point before that. We don't want to grow to the maximum size of the economy or the maximum size of the population. We want to stop at some earlier point and leave room for other things than material consumption and other things than more people on the planet. And this, I believe, is the very first conception of sustainability. So this was 1857. In 1987, so 130 years later, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who you see here, led a committee of the United Nations that formulated sustainable development and actually used those words, right? And they said sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's very hard to disagree with this, right? it says, well, do things, but make sure that you're not hurting the people who come after you. That's essentially what sustainability is about. And if we all follow this rule and future generations follow this rule as well, then we sustain human societies, we sustain human flourishing, right? And because it is such an appealing formulation, because it is very hard to disagree with this and much easier to agree with this, basically all countries on the planet, basically all corporations, all organizations now say we want to be sustainable. We support sustainable development. There is hardly any organization or political party that is against sustainable development. Even the Trump administration still supports sustainable development, right? Even the government of North Korea supports sustainable development. It is a universal goal. And that is, of course, the art of diplomacy, right? That you come up with a formulation that everybody can get behind. This is, of course, not what academics do, right? Because it is actually a very vague definition. What are the needs of the present, right? What are needs? Does that mean that everybody has a place to live and clothes to wear and food to eat? Are those the needs? I sometimes have a need to just lie in front of the telly with beer or wine and what's the silliest show there is, right? That is a real need. I think it feels real. Is it really real? What are the needs of future generations? How do we know their needs, right? And how would we know that we have compromised those needs? We don't know what future generations will be like, right? You guys are all around 20, so you know that the previous generation, namely your parents, has very peculiar ideas about certain things, right? And I can bet you that your children will think the same thing about you, right? And you will think that of your children, that they have the most peculiar tastes and attitudes. I can assure you that that is the case. So how do we know their needs, let alone how those needs are compromised, right? And that is, of course, the strength of diplomacy, to come up with sort of a sentence, in this case, that is appealing, but at the same time resists sort of like a very strict interpretation. Now, this academics hate that, right? So what people have done is said, well, this is too vague, I'm going to replace it with something more precise. And Billy Bragg, I think, expressed this best: the temptation to take the precious things we have apart to see how they work must be resisted, for they never fit together again. And that is, of course, what academics do, right? They take things apart, and then, in this case, because it's diplomacy, not academia, they don't fit back together again. So I'm going to take you through two of the main definitions of sustainability. The first is weak sustainability, and Jack Pezzi, as he's now known, as shown here, argues that sustainability means that utility does not fall, right? Hardwick said, well, that really means that consumption does not fall. And the Hardwick rule, and this is Hardwick, formulated in 1977 already, is that a constant level of consumption can be maintained perpetually from an environmental endowment if all the scarcity rents, that is the net price or the profit from resource extractions, are invested in other capital. That is what we want to do. The aim of sustainable development is to keep the principle intact and live off the services, right? That is essentially how Hardwick interpreted this. Now, Solow, who you see here, sort of said, well, on a finite planet, if you want to have that consumption does not fall on a finite planet, that means that consumption must be constant over time. And those are the three of the main interpretations of weak sustainability. Right? And you already see that there's multiple versions of this. There's multiple definitions. What these three gentlemen do not answer is whose utility? Is this average utility? Is this median utility? Is this utility of the worst off in society? Ditto for consumption. And if you say that consumption must not fall, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that this should not happen at a decadal time scale, or should it not happen on an annual time scale, or should it not happen on a monthly time scale? Obviously, a recession, when consumption falls, is not unsustainable, right? If the economy recovers and somebody losing their job, and that typically leads to a drop in income, is not unsustainable, right? So it must be at some sort of systemic level, and it must be at a decadal time scale, or maybe 5 years, or maybe 15 years. That is hard to answer. The key thing here is that what matters is human welfare. And according to these weak definitions of sustainability, if we cut down all the forests, and you may like to wander around in forests, but we offer you a virtual reality instead, where you can walk in the forest, and we added out the midgets and we added out the mud, then it's actually a better experience, right? And people are happier, and therefore utility hasn't fallen and we're sustainable, right? Substitution is allowed. What matters is that humans are happy, not how they derive that happiness, right? There's also people who say, well, I don't know what is utility, I don't really know what is consumption. So again, Solo and Talbot Pates, who you see here, really what matters, and because of sort of this paternalism that we pretend to know the preferences of the people who come after us, right? Nonsense. Pates argued, it's very hard to find a good picture of the guy. Pates argued that we really should focus on the production side of the economy, not so much the consumption side of the economy. It's a bit of a cop-out, because production in the future is also very hard to imagine, and of course production serves consumption, and the way we shape production is to serve consumption. So if you argue we don't know what future preferences for consumption will be, we're just going to focus on production, of course you're not really making much progress. But the key here still is that as long as you produce human welfare, everything is fine. Now, if there's weak sustainability, there's also strong sustainability. And of course, there's also in-between sustainability, but I'm not going to talk about that because it's just in between. That is found in more environmental circles. The two guys most associated with that are Arne Næss at the top, and somewhat before that, Aldo Leopold. And they essentially argued that what needs to be sustained are natural capital stocks. Which is a nice thing to say, but cannot be taken too literally, right? Because if you just want to keep natural capital stocks the way they are, then that means that you cannot expand food consumption and you cannot transport food to where you are. So that would kill you, but you also cannot die, because then you need to be buried, and that takes up a piece of land. And if we just let you rot in the street, or if we cremate you, you are emitted as CO2 into the atmosphere, so that changes the natural stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we just leave you to rot in the street, then you also start emitting all sorts of gases and change the natural balance in that way. So whatever you do something wrong, right? So this cannot be taken literally and absolutely. So then the question pops up, what sort of substitution do you allow? The European Union has rules about this, and that are still in place in the United Kingdom as well. And one of those rules is, if you want to build a road and you cut down a piece of forest to make way for that road, then you need to replant a forest somewhere else as compensation, so that the total amount of forest stays the same. But then the question is, of course, if we cut down a bit of old growth in Wales and plant new trees in Sussex, is that really compensation? Does a new plantation compensate for old growth? Or maybe we don't plant those trees in Sussex, but we plant them in Hungary. Is that an allowable substitution? It sort of creates all sorts of issues. And the question is also what stocks are to be maintained, right? Do we want to focus on habitats? Do we want to focus on individual species? Do we want to maintain only certain genes? And that matters, right? I mean, a lot of people are worried about the polar bear. And the polar bear is on the threat of all sorts of things, including climate change. But if you look at the polar bear, really, it's just a brown bear that is white, right? So if you let the polar bear go extinct, then not a lot of genetic stuff would get lost, because it's just a subspecies, it's not a species, right? And of course we have the issue on what to do with stuff that we really hate, right? At the moment we have an administration in the United States that wants to bring back polio, right? And maybe some deep ecologists would say, well, the polio virus has a right to live, just as we all do. But I am old enough to have seen an older generation that suffered from polio. I do not want to see polio come back, right? So, yeah, there's all sorts of issues with this. Some people have said, no, really what we want to maintain is not so much the natural capital stocks. What we want to maintain the ability of nature to keep on functioning as we think it should. And then you're much more flexible, right? As long as there is stuff that makes oxygen for us, then it's fine. It does not necessarily have to be a rainforest. It could also be seaweed that also produces oxygen, right? As long as there is enough oxygen, we're fine. But that is, of course, reasoning from from an animal perspective, that we do need the oxygen, right? The advantage of this set of definitions is that it is a more flexible system, but it sort of creates all sorts of raises all sorts of other questions as well. And the whole issue of stability is, of course, one that is problematic in its own right, because there's actually no reason to believe that ecosystems are stable by nature. Actually, evolution tells us that they're not stable, right? That they constantly change. So there's no real way out. Now, adherents of strong sustainability often argue with Malthus and with Jevons and with the Club of Rome that humanity is growing too big, right? That we exceed sort of the natural boundaries of planet Earth. Human society, human populations have grown too big. And these people call for degrowth. Now, degrowth is a neologism, right? It's a new word. It's a silly new word because we had a perfectly good word in the English language for degrowth, the opposite of growth, and that is shrink, right? What these people argue for is economic shrink, but they do not dare to say that word because of its connotation, and therefore they made up this new word. If you point it out to them, they immediately say, no, we don't mean that you should shrink, we mean that you should grow differently, that you should grow spiritually, but get poorer materially, right? Is what they say. This is a fairly popular thing in environmental circles, including in some parts of the economics profession. I think it's mostly a pastime of middle-class economists, middle-class academics who've never tasted poverty. But you cannot deny that there's a lot of literature on this. Another objection to economic shrink is, we could say this in Europe, right, where most people are fairly well-to-do, that we could do with a little bit less. That is an argument that you can make. Whether people want to do it a little bit less is a different argument, but definitely it's feasible. But of course, in large parts of the world, people live in abject poverty, right? And the idea of denying economic growth to those people, many people, including me, find repugnant, right? And then the degrowthers say, yeah, but we can redistribute our income. So I have two graphs on that. The first, in blue, you're looking from left to right. The poorest countries on the planet, Burundi is listed there, and then some of the richest countries on the planet. This is GDP per capita. GDP is a bad way to measure economic activity in Ireland. That is why Ireland comes top. And then the scale, the vertical scale is logarithmic, right? So it is a straight line, but it's of course an exponential one. And you see enormous differences in living standards. Then in orange is redistribution, right? We just took the money from the rich and gave it to the poor, and if we do so without any loss of efficiency, then the average income on the planet would be around $11,000 per person per year. This is a very decent income, right? That would be living standards in the Maldives or Kazakhstan or something like that, right? That's Croatia, perhaps. That is a very sort of pleasant and comfortable life. You immediately see the problem, right? In the UK, incomes would fall from 47,000 to 11,000. That's a 73% drop, right? And it would be hard to get sort of a coalition together of voters and political parties that would support this. But there is another issue, and that is shown on this graph. What we're looking at here is, again, we rank the countries from poorest to richest. But in blue, you're looking at CO2 emissions per person. And what you see is that the blue curve that is here is actually a good bit steeper than the blue curve that is sort of implied here. Of course, it's about noisier because we still rank people on income. That is, if your income doubles, your CO2 emissions grow, but they do not double, right? They increase by less than 100%. And that implies that if we redistribute income, then everything else follows from that. People start using more energy in countries that are currently poor, and people in countries that are currently rich are going to use less energy, but because this relationship is less than 45 degrees, the drop in emissions that you would see in previously rich countries would be smaller than the increase in emissions that you would see in currently poor countries. And as a result of this redistribution, emissions actually go up by about a third. So this notion of degrowth and redistribution solving our environmental problems, it's just empirically not true. And of course, it's politically infeasible, right? But a astounding number of environmentalists argue for this. Now, final chapter, 12 minutes left. There's also a group of people out there who argue that sustainability is just a social construct, right? That sustainability is what we agree it is, and there's no denying there. There's no hard physics behind this or anything. It's just sustainability is what we think it is. Now, going back to libertarianism, there's also a whole bunch of people who think actually that the real purpose of sustainability is to agree on that definition, that what matters here are things such as direct democracy and participatory agenda setting and all that sort of stuff. And that is really what it is about. It is about the process towards sustainable development that is much more than sustainable development itself. And the first thing that this crowd did was argue, well, the original focus of sustainability is on the environment, but there are other things that are important too, and they are sustainable as well. And you can sort of like see the reasons why you would argue this, right? Because shortly after Brundtland released her report, everybody was talking about sustainability, and it was seen as an environmental issue, and everybody was talking about this, and everybody was enthusiastic. So people who were sort of advocating for other good causes were sort of left out in the cold. And they did a smart thing. They said, but my cause is also sustainable, right? So the first thing that people did was say environment, but also social issues and economic issues. So that was the first stage, and then the second stage, and that is where we are now. The United Nations formulated 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And they launched that with big fanfare. This is Ed Sheeran, who launched the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I think because Ed Sheeran is one of the few guys on the planet who can sing fast enough to cram all 17 into a 3-minute song. And here are the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And every organization on the planet adheres to them. And you've probably seen that in all your classes at the University of Sussex, there must be a list of the Sustainable Development Goals that this particular module supports, right? It is bizarre. Here we have the 17, or rather the first set of the 17 of Sustainable Development Goals, and I have them color-coded, right? So the first one is to end poverty. Second one is to end hunger, ensure healthy living, ensure inclusive and equitable education, gender equality, sanitation for all, affordable energy for all. This is not environment, right? These are worthy goals. They're all social goals. Environment has disappeared from the Sustainable Development Goals. The next one is a bit weird because essentially one of the Sustainable Development Goals is to have sustainable development, right? Yes, this is a tautology. But also there is sustained economic growth, right? That is still a little bit in there. resilient infrastructure, reduce inequality, livable cities, sustainable, this is again, right, the goal of sustainable development is to have sustainable consumption and production. Yes, right. What else? And then way down the list, we actually have a few of environmental issues. So combat climate change, conserve oceans, and conserve terrestrial ecosystems, right? And then again, we go back to social things, promote peaceful and inclusive societies. So the original environmental agenda of Brundtland has been completely diverted towards social goals. I'm not saying that this is wrong, I'm just saying it has changed, right? And sustainable development is now about all sorts of other things. Now, why is this problematic from an analytical perspective? This actually goes back to Jan Tinbergen, who you see at the top, who argues that if you have n problems, you need n solutions. And this was actually not a very original thought. It actually goes back to Joseph Louis Lagrange, who you see there, right? And this is perhaps best understood with this metaphor. If you ride a bicycle, you want one handlebar to steer the bicycle. If you have a bicycle where two people are pulling in different directions on the same handlebar, chances are you'll get into an accident, right? So if you have one bike, you want one handlebar to steer the bike. Similarly, if you have two bikes, then you need two handlebars. And in this particular picture, they are rigidly attached to each other. With this construction, you can go straight, but it's very difficult to make a corner and not fall off the bike, right? So if you have two bikes, you need two handlebars. If you have three bikes, you need three. If you have one bike, you need one. And that is essentially what Tinbergen and Lagrange said. The problem with sort of like taking sustainable development and saying it includes everything that is good and proper is that you lose sight of this. So a very concrete example, a lot of our environmental problems originate in agriculture. That's where nitrogen and phosphorus and all those things come out and are washed into surface waters, create hypoxia and those sort of things, eutrophication. That's where a lot of antibiotics end up in the environment. That's where a lot of other stuff ends up in the environment. Other environmental problems are associated with energy use. And a lot of the air pollutants come out of the energy that we use. A lot of climate change comes out of the energy that we use. And that is simply the fact of where the problems originate. So if you want to solve these things, then inevitably you're going to put taxes on energy, you're going to put taxes on food, or you're going to force people and companies to use different technologies that they would not want to use, so they are probably more expensive or less convenient or something. So in one way or another, you're going to, through environmental policy, you're going to raise the price of food and energy. And that may be worthwhile. But then you realize that food and energy are necessary goods. That is, poorer people spend a larger share of their income on energy and food than do richer people. So if you're going to make energy and food more expensive for environmental reasons, that's going to disproportionately hurt the poorer in society. There's just no two ways around this, right? And by saying we want more equity, we want more egalitarian distribution of income, and we want a cleaner environment, those are conflicting goals. But if you say, I want sustainable development, then you're hiding what is a real trade-off, right? You pretend that this is one problem, whereas in fact it's two problems. And if it's two problems, you need two solutions. And the answer to the dilemma that I just sketched is not sustainable development, right? Because that is just becomes an empty slogan. And by sort of like shuffling everything under one agenda, you're essentially missing the trade-offs, and you're essentially no longer able to say, well, this is the solution to this problem, this is the solution to that problem, the problems interact, so we need a third intervention to make sure that we're serving both goals. By just calling everything sustainable development, as people do nowadays, you completely miss that picture. Okay, that's all for this week. I have